Hey, what's up, everybody? Justin here to talk about my second favorite console of all time, the Sega Saturn. Yes, before I go on, I know my air conditioning's on, but it's really hot right now, so I'm keeping it on no matter what. I tried opening the windows, but it doesn't do shit. But anyway, one of the main reasons why I wish to dedicate an episode to the Sega Saturn is that it's the console and its unique import library played an important component in my interest in Japan and wanting to study Japanese. So I figured this would be a good opportunity to share my Saturn story and my top five favorite Saturn games with you all, and how my brothers and I got our Saturn. And that story is a really funny. It's a really funny story that we'll get around to. But first, I would like to explain why I was relatively late to the game. Well, I'm not here to talk about why the Saturn didn't do well in the US. That subject, it's been done to death and back. And then back to death, to heaven and hell, and limbo or purgatory or wherever the hell you want to call it, or whatever seven levels of hell and back. But I'll admit its lack of success in the US did play a part as to why I was kind of late to the Saturn game. However, I do remember when Saturn Day first arrived. It was around May of 1995, and it was around the time that I was finishing the fifth grade. So prior to that, the Sega 32X and the Sega CD were already out for a few years by then, and so the Sega CD itself it cost more than the Sega Genesis, and the 32X was more or less out of my radar. But then when the Saturn arrived, not only did I feel overwhelmed with like new Sega products, the Saturn was launching at 400 US dollars. And of course, even to an 11-year-old boy to me at the time, yeah, before I was turning 11, that was a whole lot of money. I thought it was cool Sega made a whole new console and all, but it was really abrupt, expensive, and its launch library was pretty underwhelming to the best of my recollection. So for the next 2 years, it was just something that was just merely in the corner of my eye. Then 2 years later, in May of 1997, on the second to last day of school, I was finishing the seventh grade, and one of my brothers was finishing the sixth grade, and one of my other brothers was finishing the fourth grade. So, as a present for him for finishing elementary, he was going to get a Saturn, like how I got a PlayStation when I finished the sixth grade. And by then, the Saturn had gotten cheaper. To the best of my recollection, my parents got it for like 150 bucks, and this was the Saturn that included Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Cop, and Daytona USA. But the story that leads into when my brother got his Saturn or our Saturn, whatever you want to say, is largely why I can't forget when it happened. As I said before, it was the second to last day of the school year. It was during lunchtime, and some punk slapped me across the head from behind while I was having lunch, and then he ran off. I chased him down, cornered him down, and kicked him down with my taekwondo kicks. I was then restrained by the lunch lady, who then took us to the security guard, who then took us to the principal. This was when zero tolerance policies were becoming a thing in U.S. schools, so we were both suspended, and what would just be the last day of school anyway. So, as for my parents, I don't remember my parents and I having a talk. Um, it was just like they knew the school had a reputation for fights. They knew it was people could get jumped at any time, and they pretty much believed the story that I defended myself, and that was it. And yeah, in the sense, suspending me did me a favor because all my classmates were douchebags, and all the teachers were pretty much jerk offs. So, yeah, pretty much, yeah. In the end, my parents they just looked at it as what the situation was. It was inevitable, and they kind of looked at it as a boys will be boys kind of thing. Then after we had dinner that evening, we went to Best Buy to get the Saturn for my brother. Then we went home and played the games together. Oh man. Now here comes the funny part. So then the following day, just being suspended on the last day of school and me home alone, my brothers at school and my parents at work, I spent the whole day playing our new Saturn. So even if my parents did ground me, they were in no position to enforce it. So I wasn't formally grounded, not because they couldn't, but because they just really couldn't enforce it with just me being by myself. So um, they could have hidden it, but I pretty much knew the house inside and out anyway. So even where all the dirty magazines and videos were. So no use hiding from me. So yeah, even if they did ground me, what do you expect like a 12-year-old dude? You expect a 12-year-old to comply with that? Certainly not, even when they're home alone. But anyway, having that data myself was what allowed me to develop my foundational appreciation for the Saturn. I don't know if you want to take it as a positive or a negative, but an overwhelmingly majority of the Saturn library was exclusive to Japan. For example, X-Men versus Street Fighter. It was the game that made me realize that Japan was getting all the good games for the Saturn, and I came to learn that the Saturn had some popularity in Japan as well. And this is still in 1997, towards the end of it. So um, you're probably asking yourself the question, how did my brothers and I get exposed to the import scene, especially when we're just, preteens? Well, when we were living in the small city in Arizona, there was this game called Game Zone, which unfortunately closed a few years ago, but I think it either opened that year or the year before, either 96 or 97, I mean. So and the thing was, this store specialized in selling import games. So my interest in Japan ignited shortly before this happened through anime during a winter vacation trip to the Philippines towards the end of 1994 and the start of 1995. My cousins there exposed me to Dragon Ball Z, and I was blown away by it. And my thoughts were I wanted to see more of what Japan had to offer along with anime, and the Saturn games were just another method in getting that particular fix. And then I remember towards Christmas of 1997, my brothers and I saw two Japanese games we just had to have. Of course, one of them was just what I showed you, X-Men versus Street Fighter, and the other is Dragon Ball Z Legends. Thankfully, the people who worked there were smart and gave us like a Saturn converter in order to play the Japanese games on a American Saturn, and they just gave us the tutorial and how to swipe the converter card for the 4 megabit RAM expansion for X-Men versus Street Fighter, which we were told it would allow the game to practically be almost arcade perfect. So we're like, oh hell yeah! And after that, my brothers and I would largely follow the import scene, and we bought little to no American games, funny enough, and we still practice that to this very day. It's obvious because I live in Japan and all. And despite having no Japanese comprehension at the time, I still enjoyed them, because, take for example, X-Men versus Street Fighter, it takes little to no Japanese comprehension. But, with me being at 13 and little to no resources and no means to study, I just took what I could get. But thankfully, the high school I would later go to would have Japanese classes, and when I saw the course catalog for it, I signed up without any hesitation whatsoever. So even though I didn't really need to know Japanese, like take for example, at home I would try to study the hiragana characters on the instruction booklet of this game, and to review and practice. But studying Japanese and gaming, that's another story for another time. And going back to the Japan thing, why it was success, why Saturn was a success there, it was largely contributed to a series of commercials known as Segata Sanshiro, the console's mascot, who was a spoof of Sugata Sanshiro, an old Akira Kurosawa movie about a judo fighter. The character was played by Hiroshi Fujioka, whose breakout role 20 years prior to that was being the original Kamen Rider. As Segata Sanshiro, he would advertise the console or a number of games for the console in his commercials. And in some of these commercials and in his music video, he would tell people Sega Saturn Shiro, meaning you must play Sega Saturn. You got to check these out on YouTube. You're going to get a hell of a laugh. And of course, he had his own game for the Saturn as well. I do have it, but it's in my parents' house in Arizona. And for Sega's 60th anniversary, yeah, yeah, Fujioka, he came back to the role along with his son Maito to play the character's son, Sega Shido, or You Must Play Sega. Now, I like to share my top five favorite games on the Saturn, and due to how I set this up already, this won't be in particular order because one obvious example of my top favorite Saturn games is X-Men versus Street Fighter. It's pretty much the beginning of the Marvel versus Capcom series, which pretty much combines X-Men Children of the Atom and Street Fighter Zero 2, or Street Fighter Alpha 2, I'm sorry. And then you put them together as one game. While its gameplay takes more from its influence from X-Men, the Street Fighter characters perfectly fit with the style. And what's also cool is the inclusion of Sabretooth, Gambit, and Rogue, who are not even characters in Children of the Atom. And considering their popularity with pre-existing X-Men fans, they were more than perfect to have. And as you already know, what makes these games unique is their tag team play. And the only games notable for this were just wrestling games, which makes perfect sense in that particular sport. But the engine and the novelty just added a fresh element and really pushed the pace like no other fighting game before it. And unfortunately, this version was Japan only, and the rest of the world got a crummy ass PS1 port that might as well have been running, you know, been powered by a potato. But if you want a true experience, Sega Saturn Shiro! And as also mentioned earlier, Dragon Ball Z Legends is another game that attracted me to the Saturn. Yes, there is a PlayStation port, but the Saturn offers a little more novelty. For example, like in the original anime, the Saturn version allows you to knock your opponents through rocks, mountains, and trees, but the PS1 version doesn't. And I know the attacks have some differences, but I strongly recommend the Saturn version. And considering how far DBZ games have gone since post 2000s, Legends may not be for newer or younger fans. The gameplay is unique in that you don't fight until someone's life bar is depleted, but you exchange punches and kicks in something of a tug of war struggle to fill a meter on the bottom of the screen in order to unleash a certain attack like a Kamehameha, which could then cause damage to the life bar. And depending on the attack, it could take anywhere from 3 to 4 attacks to beat your opponent. Since filling the meter may take time due to you and your opponent's skill levels. The fights could go on forever, just like the original anime. So I recommend this game for those who have patience. And another must-have for Saturn and for those who love 3D fighters, um, Fighters Megamix. This is the game to have. And just a few years before Nintendo was doing Smash Brothers, Sega was already doing something of a mixed mashup fighting game of their characters with Fighters Megamix. In addition to having the full roster of Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighting Vipers, some notable unlockables are Rent a Hero, a few characters from Sonic the Fighters. Unfortunately, Sonic or Tails is one of them. Hornet, the car from Daytona, USA. And its foundation is largely with Fighting Vipers and Virtua Fighter 2, but it works well with the other characters if you're, it works well if you're a veteran of either game. So it should be an easy transition for some of those players. And the game was made as a compromise as the Saturn was unable to port Virtua Fighter 3. This is clearly seen through the inclusion of Janet from Virtua Cop 2, whose moveset is clearly based on Aoi from Virtua Fighter 3 with her Aiki Jujutsu. And considering Janet being a cop and all, I think that's an appropriate fighting style to give her. And if you're a pro wrestling fan, then I strongly recommend Fire Pro Wrestling Six Man Scramble. While the rest of the world has been getting the remainder of the series post 2000, the original Six Man Scramble for the Saturn still holds up very well, especially for six-player play. And if you've played the current versions, then this game should be easy for you since they're relatively the same game in terms of gameplay and foundation. It has one of the deepest creative wrestler features you can get in any wrestling game, and you can get a lot of gimmick matches, most notably the exploding barbed wire cage match one. The game also features some real wrestlers, of course, but with different names. But when you see them, you'll be able to recognize who's supposed to be Hulk Hogan, Sting, the Steiner brothers, and whoever the big stars were upon its original release. And not only do I recommend this to Saturn fans, but to wrestling lovers as well, who are looking for like a really deep challenge and something really cool. And this game has a unique learning curve, so some patience should be necessary when approaching. If you smell what the Justin is cooking. Lastly, I would also love to share number five, Magic Knight Rayearth, based on the hit anime. I remember reading about this in magazines back in '95 when it was supposed to come out in the US. But unfortunately, Working Designs lost the data and they had to rework it from scratch. And then later, it would finally get a release in the end of '98, which would then in turn become the final game released in the US for the Sega Saturn. And I remember getting this game, and I still have my copy of the US release somewhere in my house. But of course, the Japanese version is fun too. So this is pretty much, akin to, let's say, Legend of the old school Legend of Zelda's, like the first one for the NES and Ocarina, no, not Ocarina at that time, A Link to the Past, which is like an overhead view, but instead of like one character, you have the Magic Knights. So if you're pretty much familiar with the original anime or manga, then I strongly recommend you get this game. Um, it's not that long, and you get cutscenes from the anime, and the dub is pretty good as well. And they also do the dub to the opening theme, Yuzu Nine Guy. And I don't remember who the singer was, but I remember the singer for the song from Learner, Wind's Nocturne. She also does that version. And because of my exposure to that dub, um, it's the reason why I could never bring myself to watch the anime version of the dub without that song and without these actors. But um, I understand that in the U.S. now this goes pretty high, but in Japan, on average, you can get it between 2,000, 3,000 yen, and at the current exchange rate, that's like 15 to 20 bucks. And I would also like to give some honorable mentions to Panzer Dragoon RPG, Street Fighter Zero 03, Sakura Taisen, Bulk Slash, and Knights. I would do a top 10, but there's still so much to talk about in terms of the Saturn and with this video. And what's also neat about the Saturn is the many of its peripherals that you can use with it, but with a good portion of them, I think, being exclusive to Japan. One was the Virtuo Stick Pro, which I've done a video of a couple years ago, and it's a two-player stick like a real arcade. And as I said, I did a video on that, and it's back in my parents' house in Arizona, so I'm in no position to physically show it to you. But yeah, for fighting game arcade lovers, it is or arcade fighting game lovers, it is certainly a must-have. To the best of my recollection, I paid about less than 45,000 yen for mine, and that's still the going price for it, even with or without the box. But regular one-player sticks are still awesome, and some are still available in the North American market, but they were largely sold in black to be consistent with the non-Japanese Saturn being black. But in Japan, they sold them in many colors. Unfortunately, they're also in the US too. And there's also a Tyson cable or a special connection cable to connect two Saturns in the same manner. You could connect two Game Boys. Um, so it's good for certain games like Virtual On. And speaking of Virtual On, another peripheral that was exclusive to Japan is this Virtual On stick. Of course, this was made for Virtual On in mind, but it's also compatible with episodes 2 and 3 of Gundam Blue Destiny. And I also heard that some fans modified it to make it compatible with Bulk Slash, which is pretty cool. And another cool accessory here is this mission stick, which I think was available in the US. But as you can tell by this color, this is the Japanese version. And if you're looking to enjoy Afterburner and Space Harrier like you did when you played it at the arcades, then this is the controller to have. I don't know about the American or European library, but this is also compatible with Panzer Dragoon Zwei. I think with double six too, if I might be correct. So yeah, for shooters, that's the game to have. And what I also have here is this mouse and this keyboard, which is something you could use with the Saturn's internet browser, which is something that I do not have because not only do I not have the browser, I don't have the modem as well. But I know you can still find modems in the wild, both in the US and in Japan. But yeah, I just really haven't had the time to really look into it. But in case of you didn't know, Saturn also had its own word processing software and printer, which I could get, but I have no space for. The Saturn also has its own programming software to make your own games, which is pretty cool. And as for the mouse, I'm so used to laser mouses to the point that I forgot they used to use mouse balls. And sometimes you do need to clean the dust off from the inside. And the games I played with the mouse are the original Panzer Dragoon, Sakura Taisen, a Godzilla game, and Virtual Cop. So it's a good alternative to the light gun, which is compatible with Virtual Cops 1 and 2, House of the Dead, and the shooting portion of Snatcher. I do have a couple of light guns, but I can't find them right now. And also, there was this floppy disk drive for Saturn in Japan, and they tend to go anywhere from a little over 20,000 yen to a little over 40,000 yen in Akihabara, depending if it has certain peripherals available or not, like a power supply or the original box, and some other parts that I can't remember off the top of my head. Since I know a few places in Akihabara that still sell floppy disks, I was considering getting one, but when I discovered it was only compatible with a limited number of games, I opted not to get one. And for those of you who also love to play racing games, the steering wheel is also a must-have. I have one in the closet behind me, but it's like really, really deep, and I have to go through like layers of boxes to get there, and I just don't want to make a mess right now. So you can look up on Google for the Saturn racing wheel. The design is more in tune with how Formula One racing cars steering wheels are designed as opposed to traditional steering wheels. So it can take some getting used to with the way you have to grip and how you steer. So Saturn for both Japan and outside of Japan have a good amount of fun racing games to play. So you should definitely get one if you're a racing game fan. And of course, there's also the 3D controller. This is like called the multi-pad controller in Japanese. Let me see. Sega, yeah, the multi-controller is what they called it. So it was tailor-made for this game nights, and for the way the game works, the the 3D stick, it's really intuitive with how the game works. But I forget what other games work with it, but you know, it's still a must-have for this game, and for other games as well. And it really has a nice grip. And the greatest thing about Saturn is its unique and dedicated community. There are teams and individuals who are making translations for Sakura Taisen, Bulk Slash, and Grandia. And presently, there are people who are making ports of the original Metal Gear Solid and the X-Men arcade game. I've seen videos of it, and they look really phenomenal. And as a lifelong X-Men fan, it really makes me happy. Yes, the Saturn did have a reputation of being a difficult console to program for the longest time. But people now understand it more than ever, and yeah, and now it's easily emulatable. However, going to that subject, it seems to be the case for Americans because from what I understand, its rushed launch didn't allow developers to learn how to work with its hardware, and I heard they weren't really given much instructions on how to work with it. But other than that, if you're a hardcore retro gamer that's into retro Japanese games, then the Saturn is certainly for you. Um, but like I said, it is unfortunate a lot of unique games didn't leave Japan. But back then, a good portion of these games were, for lack of a better word, too Japanese at the time to find any success outside of Japan. While there are other great titles like X-Men vs. Street Fighter that should have gotten international releases, but considering the low user base and how late it was into the console's lifespan, it probably wouldn't have made a difference. But other than that, I know the international market for certain games like Panzer Dragoon RPG and Magic Knight Rare are getting higher, but you can get them for cheap in Japan. But of course, when it comes to games like those, Japanese comprehension will be necessary. But of course, we're now in the age of gods. However, it's not like Japan is immune to having some expensive games either, such as Crows, Final Fight, or Street Fighter Zero 03, but much cheaper compared to Panzer Dragoon or Magic Knight Rare. Anyway, thanks for listening to my experiences. And if you're more interested in the Saturn, I recommend you guys check out the Sega Saturn Shiro podcast. And until next time, Sega Saturn Shiro!